And we are lucky to have with us this esteemed panel moderated by Emma Cardelli, who is an attending psychologist and research associate at the Trauma and Community Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital, as well as an instructor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. So go ahead, Emma, take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, well, I am not going to take much time away from this illustrious panel we have here, but I do want to just set a little bit of a foundation for this conversation by saying a few things. One, I want to make it really, really clear that mental illness does not cause mass violence, but mental health professionals can still help prevent it. We can do something about it. Mental health providers also cannot be alone in this work and really will need to partner with others to effectively reduce hate-fueled violence. And although we still have a very long way to go in terms of understanding what truly predicts risk and resilience to hate-fueled violence, this panel here aims to leverage lessons learned from mental health and psychosocial support programming with other populations that I would say have similar risks, needs, and strengths to help practitioners be more deliberate in using existing evidence-based treatments, best practice guidelines we have to prevent violence. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim first to share a little bit with us, about your work, please.
Thank you. Glad to see everybody here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to sort of start the stage, I guess, the conversation we'll have up here. My experience, my background primarily is mental health, many years in the field of mental health. And just wanted to talk a little bit about one perspective that I think has been helpful in terms of moving into this space of thinking about terrorism, targeted violence, hate crimes, etc. And within the field of mental health, the issue of what's been oftentimes called trauma-informed care as a framework for thinking about risk factors, resilience factors, why we see some of the things we see in clinical practice, why we have some of the struggles we see in clinical practice. But one way of thinking about trauma-informed care, and there's a term that's come up in work we're doing in Illinois, and it's not don't quote me, I don't know where this term came from. But we brought it up in our work in Illinois, and it's really, I think, captures the sense of how to approach things from a trauma-informed care perspective, and that is moving away from the phrase, what happened to you, and moving towards the phrase, I just did that backwards. Rewind, like Willy Wonka, reverse that. Moving away from what's wrong with you and moving towards what happened to you. And that's a difficult pivot to make in some spaces because oftentimes you're working with people who are saying things which are hard to hear, engaging in behaviors which are hard to think about or to acknowledge, but thinking about what happened to people, what happened in their lives, in their early lives, the kind of traumas they have perhaps experienced, can at least begin to inform why you're seeing some of the issues that you're seeing. What we see when we look at people who have trauma histories is oftentimes collections of things like cognitive issues, cognitive difficulties, different kinds of limited coping skills, all kind of as a consequence of the trauma they've had. And so, working with people with these kinds of traumas and cognitive difficulties, you may find, for example, people who are very rigid black and white thinkers. People are all good or all bad. And that can be a challenge from a clinical perspective. And it can be one of the reasons why, at least when you start looking at people who move down the pathway of targeted violence and hate crimes, they may grab on to certain narratives and not let go. They may gravitate towards certain populations that reinforce their kind of cognitive rigidity. When you are already seeing the world as sort of all good or all bad, and you find yourself in a group of people who agree with you and escalate that kind of reinforced thinking, it can be hard because, again, this is a kind of a cognitive dissonance that's coming about because of the trauma. So I know in the clinical world, the mental health world, trying to understand that when you look at where people have kind of gotten to in their difficulties with hate crimes or targeted violence, I was having a conversation yesterday, and the example I was using is if you start to run their life movie backwards and you try to get back to sort of their origin story, at the origin story, you'll start to see a lot of kind of similarities with a lot of people. Things like depression and anxiety, loneliness, isolation. And some of that may be fueled by trauma history. Some of that may lead people into pathways where they are re-traumatized. And we know that those kind of risk factors can lead you in a lot of different paths. So once you start moving the film forward, you don't necessarily know where this path is going to go. They can go a lot of different ways. To your point, the path is not always towards violent extremism or engaging in some kind of mass casualty incident. But if we get in the habit of moving the film backwards a bit and thinking about the origin stories for the people that we're interested in addressing and working with, we're starting to really see that trauma histories, trauma before they got involved in some of these movements, trauma that can be caused by being involved in these movements in terms of exposure to violence can re-traumatize people. And again, we know that trauma has a variety of kind of cognitive and emotional ramifications. And so it's been helpful in some ways to think about risk factors as something coming about through this sort of trauma lens. And like I said, moving more towards trying to understand what happened to people rather than jumping to the gun and just saying, what's wrong with you, and kind of pathologizing right off the bat. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Please, David. Yeah.
So can you guys hear me okay? Good. Just checking. So just to set the context, so I'm from Yorktown Family Services. I'm the Director of Mental Health. And we run a program in Toronto, Canada called ETA, Estimated Time of Arrival. So it's a direct service intervention that helps youth, young adults, and adults move away from violent extremism and violent ideologies. Basically, we work with people across the ideological spectrum, and we also engage with people pre-radicalization right up to people that have expressed ambitions to commit attacks and maybe have been given a second chance by police to redirect them. So it's quite the wide spectrum. One of the things when we started the program in 2020, prior to that, I'll go back a few years in 2017, when I started at the organization, we were referred a couple cases from our Toronto Police Service. One was a white supremacist kid, 17-year-old, and the other was a couple people returning from a war zone that potentially suspected by intelligence services were radicalized. Never had done this work before. We said as an organization, sure, we'll try it out. It didn't really have a model, but what we did kind of learn quickly is that the folks we were working with had multiple needs that required an interdisciplinary team approach. And not just mental health needs, but basic needs, shelter, housing, food, security, and the list went on, even physical health needs, coming back from a war zone, dental work, eye exams. So we learned quickly that we needed to have a holistic model. And so we looked at the organization, what did we have in place already? And we already work from integrated care approach at Yorktown. So we actually used that sort of approach, so interdisciplinary, integrated care, and really began to, when we wrote the proposal, formalize this model a bit more and looking in the areas of gang intervention and gang exit, domestic sex trafficking exit, and also crisis support services. The reality is the people we work with are often in crisis. They're homicidal and suicidal. And so we needed an approach where we were engaging with them, or at least part of our model, engaging with them on a regular basis, sometimes a daily basis, having platforms that were accessible, in particular youth and young adult friendly, so text messaging, online resources or online interactions, going to where people are at, so not having them come to our office. So that really community-based, on-the-ground approach, which we had done in other areas in the organization, and also having multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams wrapped around people, so people could do their piece of the work. So a mental health therapist, looking at engagement workers and outreach workers, working with this person at the same time to address the various needs. But one of the things that we're learning more and more is sort of the work of crisis intervention services. So basically, we are mobile, which crisis services can be. We can go to people's homes. We can respond to calls after hours, and we're hoping to get more funding to do that in a more proper way. But really, we kind of took that access mechanisms for when people are in crisis. Because you think about it, people that are in this space, if they become homicidal and suicidal, that's a real threat to the community, real threat to themselves. And so it may not be police worthy at the time, but certainly a step before that is when they can call us. We've introduced that crisis support within our model. When we think of domestic sex trafficking and how people fall into that and how people are groomed into those spaces, primarily female, women and females, is that we needed to kind of learn how to teach people critical thinking. So how do you know you're being taken advantage of, especially if you're being groomed into an extremist organization or group or ideology. So we took some lessons from there around critical thinking. So again, not always just focusing on the mental health pieces and crisis pieces, but also, helping people understand the bigger picture, stopping and thinking. When you see information online, how do you dissect that? Why is that happening? Why are people putting that out? What impact do they want to have on you? I think the other piece too, we know that the research says, and from our experience, in particular with gang intervention and gang exit work, is intensive case management. We found that the more frequency and the more we engage with people, so usually 3 to 4 times a week, the quicker they were able to be rehabilitated and move out of the space. This certainly wasn't work. We found early on that it's a 1-hour therapy session once every 3 weeks. Maybe if you're in the pre-radicalized space, that could be effective, but certainly if somebody has been referred to us and they're a national security issue, or potentially, that isn't the type of treatment or frequency that they need much more intensive work. Chances are they're in a crisis kind of space. So really, some of the things that have been hallmarks when we look at domestic sex trafficking, exit, gang exit, VAW, violence against women, treatment programs, is really trauma-informed across the whole board, looking at trauma from a holistic standpoint, not just mental health, but also how does it impact your social engagement with community, and what things need to be put in place so that those basic needs are met from a trauma-informed perspective. Intensive case management, accessible on the ground, access to workers and staff, and immediate needs. The importance of peer mentorship and people with lived experience being on the team and having that lens is absolutely critical. Because who am I? I've never been an extremist, right, or involved in a white supremacist group. But so it's really important to have that element and that perspective on the team. Outreach, I think, also really, again, addressing those mental health issues, so psychiatry, looking at, some diagnostic kind of assessments and this kind of thing. But certainly, I think what I've learned and what my team has learned, that there are other models out there where you can pick out some of the elements and pull together for an intervention in this space. And that's what some of our main learnings have been over the last couple of years. So, yeah.
Thank you, David. Rajiv, please.
So just by way of an introduction, I don't stay in this space very often. I came into this space to looking at extremism when a colleague of mine at RAND brought me into a project on extremism as we noticed parallels between suicide prevention, where I do most of my work, and extremism. And so that's how I got into that, and that's where I spend most of my time. But I'm going to have my remarks in kind of 2 phases. So the first phase is we recently released a report where we noticed a lot of it was my colleague, Todd Helmus, who's here, and I looked at parallels between what we heard in narratives of extremists and former extremists and what we know about substance use disorders and addictions. And we came up with 7 kind of parallels, conditioned cues and environmental triggers, for example, that can elate someone and for both substance use as well as acting or the rush it gives them to see a Nazi symbol or something like that. There's neurobiology of vengeful retaliation, the role of stress in compulsive behavior. There's a chronic disease model. So a lot of times you think, what's extremists leave? They're gone for good, but this pullback is constant that you can read that's in the narratives, and we see that people with substance use disorders too, rates of relapse are often the norm rather than something. Psychiatric comorbidity but is similar in the same thing. The role of social relationships, your network is who you drink with, and becoming sober is leaving that friend group, and it's often not really compensated. And the same thing we can see when you leave an extremist group. And then these geographic determinants, which I think is really, really interesting. There's a notion right now in public health that your zip code predicts your health outcomes more than your genetic code. And I think that that's really true. And I think we have to be thinking about the genetic predispositions to extremism with respect to thoughts as well as behaviors. So what did we do from that information? Well, we said there's implications from prevention and treatment. From prevention, starting early, the good behavior game is a perfect example. It was an intervention in first grade classrooms. That's it. It doesn't go to second grade. It just is in first grade. Reductions in substance use, reductions in violent behavior, reductions in suicide, many, many years later in a randomized controlled trial. So how can we get models like that out there, and could they be effective? Treating externalizing behaviors early, especially for children, as well as kind of improving neighborhoods, and I'll speak more to that. And then with respect to treatment, this importance that we learn for people with substance use disorders on having the motivation to change. So can things like motivational interviewing be really effective in getting people who are on that cusp, who are thinking about leaving extremist groups, to start contemplating what that might look like. The importance of continuous care, as we talked about the chronic disease model of addiction, that it's not just a one and done thing. These people will need support for perhaps a long time, which I'll turn back to in the second part of my comments. And then finally, as I said before, that role of networks. If you're not addressing that person's social network, then you might be doomed to fail, and history will repeat itself. So that's I think from the theme of this panel, parallel fields, I think that that's where we're trying to go and see, we don't need to start anew. We don't need to start fresh. If we can draw these parallels, we can actually start testing these models and thinking about how we can apply them in this context. But I want to now shift and talk about policy, just to put these things on the table, because I think that in the conference for the past 2 days, we've had a really rosy picture that, if we just mental health and local resources, oh my God, it's great. 38% of the United States population does not live with what's considered reasonable access to a psychiatrist. Everyone's like, well, then telehealth can work. Well, we have these crazy, in my opinion, licensure rules, which really prohibit. There's some, CPAC, and there's some states that have formalized relationships, but people in New York can't necessarily start providing telehealth care to somebody in Wisconsin, a patient in Wisconsin. So this is a huge challenge. That's just psychiatrists, but projections from HRSA for psychologists, social workers, any mental counselors, they're all decreasing. So, and to make up that gap, they estimate that we need 7,000 more psychiatrists. Who knows how many more psychologists and social workers? So we take this we don't have enough of these people on the ground. We have policies that kind of impede their use, and now we're putting extra burden on them to solve this other issue that we're facing. I just don't see how it can be done without really significant policy change. There are other strategies, task shifting, where you give some, and Emma and I have talked about this, give some, there's issues with it, but you give some kind of low-level, low-acute skills to treat people with low-acuity mental health problems. You provide, librarians, teachers with these skills so that they don't necessarily need to go to formal trained mental health professionals, and maybe that'll work. We still have to see how it's working in the United States. The issue, other people have said, well, the same thing that we see in extremism, we see housing and employment. The U.S. homelessness population has risen in the past 2 years. It's not going down. Our cities are full with, homeless encampments and tents. developers are not investing necessarily in affordable housing in the United States. So again, like I just don't see how it's happening. Unemployment, well, right now we're doing pretty well with our employment numbers, but we have like this inflation crisis and recession just like looming like right ahead of us, and we're not necessarily talking about what that's going to do, especially in the context of all this, the social media that we've been hearing about. So I really do think that we need to be tackling this from a policy level. And I'll just end by saying, the last thing is that if we want to engage the mental health professionals, I think we have to have a real necessary conversation about pay, especially, everyone, especially after especially after the George Floyd movement, and everyone got really excited about, sending social workers out to police calls. Okay, so these are people who generally make $50,000 to $80,000 a year. You're having them work overnight shifts, sending them to the most violent of incidents to deal with this, potentially life-threatening situation at a $65,000 or $70,000 salary in the United States. I just don't see how that's a sustainable model.
Thank you, Rajiv. You got a lot of nods from mental health providers in this room for good reason. So appreciate you putting all those things out there.
And the social workers.
Steve, please. Yeah.
Okay. So we call upon some mental health professionals to get involved in treating people who are at risk for targeted violence. But I think we need to call upon even more of them and ask them to be gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. There's a robust literature on what it means to be a gatekeeper that comes from the fields of violence prevention and suicide prevention. And I think by drawing upon this adjacent field, mental health practitioners can build out this other important role, which is necessary for local prevention frameworks. So who are gatekeepers? Gatekeepers are people who have contact with lots of individuals because of the position they're in, and they have the trust of many people, so people come and talk to them. And they should be positioned to recognize a person who might present some kind of risk, have some behavioral warning signs that we should be concerned about, and then a gatekeeper could try to help get that person supportive services or reach out to law enforcement if it was that kind of an issue. So there are many different kinds of mental health professionals who could be gatekeepers. They could be highly trained specialists, they could be lay workers, they could be peers, they could be persons with lived experience. I think kind of like what Rajiv was just saying, we have to realize there's a very large number of them, and most of them are not as highly trained as, say, the psychologist or psychiatrist in a private practice setting. Mm-hmm. They could work in schools, they could work in communities, hospitals, clinics. Some of them do work in law enforcement or public safety. Now, in suicide prevention, gatekeepers are taught how do you question the person's desire and intent for suicide, how do you persuade them to not act, and how do you link them with supportive services. And this has been shown to be effective, and I think it could potentially be effective in violence prevention as well. Of course, we know that gatekeepers face lots of barriers to intervening. They might not know about, for example, what predicts violence. They may not feel the degree of confidence. They might think, this is not my area, I shouldn't get involved. They might be afraid for their safety or for the safety of the person that they're advocating for. So these are serious obstacles that we need to understand. So gatekeeper training is supposed to help them overcome these kinds of barriers. It's supposed to educate them about behaviors and signs of distress. It's supposed to provide them with information about how to talk with them, how to listen, how to engage, and how to motivate them, and then also where they can go for services. And it should also help them to identify immediate threats that require law enforcement referral. So another concept that's related to the idea of the gatekeeper is the engaged bystander, which I'm sure you've heard of. And as you know, an engaged bystander is somebody who intervenes before, during, or after a situation when they see or hear about behaviors that are linked with violence. So the difference between a engaged bystander and a gatekeeper is a engaged bystander is kind of in the room where it's happening and is trying to intervene. The gatekeeper is more trying to advise from kind of the sidelines. But what I think here is that the gatekeeper can also be trying to help bystanders become engaged bystanders. And this could be done by helping somebody who's in a crisis or who's a person, meaning a person who's dealing like with a family member or a friend or a coworker who's in a crisis. Or it could be done proactively if you anticipate a crisis is coming, or even if you just think it's a distant possibility. The gatekeeper can teach these potential bystanders about strategies that they can use, about what kind of behaviors to look for, how to offer support, how to connect with services or law enforcement. This could be done one-on-one or in a group format. So in Illinois, with the support of CP3, our group has developed hybrid trainings, both for mental health specialists that include gatekeeper training. Jim is involved in this work. And also for community members that's focused on engaged bystander training. These things take less than a couple of hours, and they could be done online or in person. And we're planning to evaluate these, and if impactful, I think these kind of trainings could help to fill the gaps to help community-based practitioners, mental health practitioners and others, to join into local prevention frameworks. Of course, as Rajiv just pointed out, systems also need to change. So one, there are serious issues about accessible and affordable mental health services to refer people to. I was just on a call yesterday dealing with that issue, and it happens all the time. And then two, I guess on the law enforcement side, for those cases that don't require prosecution, law enforcement needs to not kind of overuse punitive measures and or just to sign off the case, and to develop better collaborative capacities for working with multidisciplinary teams or behavioral threat assessment and management teams to provide alternative solutions for people, and then to tell those stories in communities so that people know that there's a reason for us to engage and to tell a mental health professional or someone else about someone we're concerned about, that it doesn't just mean they're going to end up in jail. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for kicking off an important conversation. I have many questions I could ask, but I want to open it up to our audience before I jump in. Chris, yeah. You want to come up to the mic or? He used it as an opportunity up here.
So thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone. I think Steve and Emma know I love this panel. I'm so happy this is happening. So I work for a peace building organization, okay? And I'm charged with trying to understand how peace building can contribute to disengagement and reintegration efforts. And it quickly became clear to me and to us that where we ended was more of a peace building public health partnership. Where peace building tools can resolve conflicts, can bridge divides, can address legitimate grievances, but we still need those public health harm reduction principles to ensure low threshold access to services and to change behaviors. I strongly believe in applying trauma-informed and behavioral health care as part of this engagement programming. What I run into, though, especially when I engage with peace-building partners, is a perception that in many of the places that we work, there's just very little or no capacity to provide these kinds of behavioral health, mental health, trauma-informed care. And that building that capacity is prohibitively difficult, which I reject, but that's what I run into. So I have to think that global behavioral health practitioners have strategies and know how to expand the reach and access to services and care. And I'm wondering, how would you respond to, these perceptions? And if you can share some of those strategies on how to expand access to care, that'd be fantastic.
Please, David, you want to kick us off?
I'll start. So I know in 2020 when we started this, we were the first one in Ontario, Toronto. We didn't know what to expect from our partners, from our staff even, because we're part of a bigger organization. And, we were worried we were going to get like, what do you mean we're going to start working with terrorists or extremists? Like, what are you doing, right? And I think what happened was it was about change management. Kind of highlighting for people the data that's globally out there around young people getting involved in hate groups and extremism, and kind of proving a point to our partners and staff that, people are not, the context is people are not born to hate, they grow into hate because of environments and because of all the things we talked about. So it was a really slow build in terms of giving people knowledge and access to knowledge that normally sat in security services, but we're now transitioning that into the public health space. And I think it took a few years for people to catch on. And I think that strategy worked well. Plus, I think mentoring staff sometimes was helpful. I think destigmatizing the labels that our clients have, because, words like terrorism and extremism come from a security kind of standpoint and political standpoint, actually. People think terrorism, at least in Canada, is still 9/11. Right? It's much more than that. So I think that's what people thought we were doing. And once the labels go away and once the ideology is put to the side, you're left with the person. So doing a lot of capacity building and training, that was internally with our staff about this is our issue. It's a community issue. Like, we have to do this like all the other things we do. This is now something new that especially young people are getting into. And so that internally worked really well, that strategy. In the community, it's been a bit more difficult outside of Yorktown. I think there was a lot of stigma against our organization for doing this. You're helping a terrorist, they're racists, and these were social workers, right? And I think also in Canada, there's a lot of anti-racism training as part of your social work training, which it's also zero tolerance, right? So if someone's racist in a session, you have the right to shut them down and send them home. We actually started saying something different. In fact, you got to talk to them more because they could be a risk. And so changing the landscape, that's where we're at now. And there's some difficult conversations happening because two things are happening at once. Extremism is increasing, which is part of racism and hate, but also anti-racism legislation and policies and organizations increasing, right? But I think we're going to get there. But I do think we have to train people coming out of healthcare, schools where healthcare is taught, and that's where it has to start. It's a little harder to jump on the train now when people have already moved forward, but I think really having programs in colleges and universities around behavioral health, CVE, PCVE is the way to go. But I think it's all about that, giving people the knowledge and some skills and some ways to engage with these folks. Builds that confidence a little, at least internally that worked well.
Steve, I know you want to add to this. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris, for your provocative question. And I think, I work in global mental health. I work in some of the poorest countries in the world. It is possible to design systems to develop evidence-based care where there are no mental health professionals. We do it all the time. And I think, this is an area where we need to reverse engineer, bring some of those strategies into the low resource settings in the United States. But it can be done. But on the other hand, I kind of want to say society has to make choices, about what it's going to invest in.
Yep.
A social
100%.
worker working in law enforcement probably costs less than, a SWAT tank or something. I mean, and I think that we have to make the case that these are essential ingredients for promoting public safety and public health, which I believe they are, but the evidence needs to be put together, and we need to be advocates for that.
Completely.
And and that's a tension that we also see in drug abuse, which is, do we counter supply or demand or both, and where do we weight the balance? But the supply reduction is a total criminal like law enforcement kind of operation, whereas the demand is public health. And there's, you can see historically where that's been funded.
And I guess I would just jump in here
Yeah.
just real quick with this. Just speaking both as a social worker and a social work educator, I have been in some ways mystified about the lack of social work in this space. And part of the reason I got involved through kind of various circuitous routes was a strong interest in trying to get social work at the table. Because when you start looking at some of the core needs of folks who are in trouble in this space, it's what social work has been doing for the past 100 years. And so then part of me is sort of like, so what's the barrier? And I was having this conversation yesterday, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. There are what I would call perceptual barriers, not actual barriers. And one of the perceptual barriers is the sense that somehow working with somebody who has dipped a toe or an entire foot in this terrorist, mindset space is somehow qualitatively or quantitatively different than who they normally work with. And the short answer is they're not really. When you put the ideology label to the side, the risk factors are what social workers have been dealing with for 100 years. So that's one perceptual barrier, is how do you get them to sort of not stare at the ideology label and look at what they've been trained to do for 100 years, which is to think about the risk factors and the resilience factors. The other perceptual barrier, I think, is the sense that somehow working with this population is more dangerous, that there are higher liabilities. But, again, social workers, mental health professionals have been dealing with people who are suicidal, homicidal. I've had to learn how to restrain people and disarm people when I worked in mental health hospitals. I've had people throw furniture at me. I mean, you learn all sorts of interesting skills when you work on an inpatient psychiatric unit. And so to me, again, that's a perceptual barrier because we know that there's nothing particular about this population that requires any kind of additional legal protection or some like extra layer of insurance. It all fits within the way people are currently practicing. So part of it is trying to understand those perceptual barriers to get people more at the table. Because I get frustrated with my own profession periodically. I've been in it long enough that I can also be critical of it. And the last thing I'll just put out there is social work is also in an interesting time right now where we have a number of sort of dogmatic leaders in the profession who are very much in the defund the police, anti-carceral, defund the prisons, let everybody go kind of mentality. And that's still the minority, but I know it creates tension even among like my colleagues who know some of the work that I do, who will raise eyebrows when I am reading something published by DHS, because they're sort of like, why are you a social worker and you're engaging with DHS? So that's another perceptual barrier, but it's frustrating. There are lots of social workers who could be at these spaces doing good work, and it's all, to some extent, a perceptual barrier.
I just want to add one thing.
Please, Dave.
What we've noticed over the last 2 years is that some of the clients we work with might be labeled as very dangerous, but actually there's a security apparatus around them that keeps us really safe. I mean, I have liaison officers I can call about a client I'm working with. In 10 seconds, they get back to me. I don't have that for the other 5,000 that we know nothing about. So the perception that, staff safety is at risk. I mean, staff safety is always at risk. You always have to be prepared. But we have found, because of, I guess, the collaborations we have, and because of the potential threat, that these are the most sort of secure clients in a lot of ways. We know everything about them before they come to us. Like there's pages of information we get. There's people off the street that come see us we know nothing about. So it's actually flipped. And I think, again, it's those cognitive distortions that our field has around perceptions of what this is. And, we got to demystify it. It's a big hill to climb, though.
And those cognitive distortions that are, bringing it back to the societal level, reflective of these broader societal issues too. I mean, we're asking, in certain ways, mental health providers to have conversations that societies as a whole have not yet figured out how to have effectively. So just bringing it back there, and I am all for mental health providers stepping into this space and doing that, but I just want to hold that challenge that it's another thing that we as societies have to figure out, where's the priority here? Can we help people figure out how to have these difficult conversations in general across the divide, which we have a long way to go there too. Please, other questions, Brett?
So this question is for Jim and Steve. When are you introducing courses that will train social workers, psychiatrists, and other clinical professionals in an educational setting so that we can grow the field with greater expertise?
Guys?
Want to go first?
There's the trainings that we're doing in the state of Illinois right now, and it's been impressive to work with the crew that is putting that training together, and building off of research and other work, and how to get that out to as many people as possible, whether they are already trained clinicians who need to be kind of get that cultural competence piece down to move into this space, as well as people on the front lines who aren't trained clinicians necessarily. I will say, I know there's going to be a panel talking about sort of curriculum in educational settings, and that's an interesting question, because again, within the field of social work specifically, it would probably be kind of difficult to do sort of like a social work specific course tackling this issue. I raised it with a couple of people in Chicago about doing something more interdisciplinary. So it would be interesting to social workers, people in criminology, people in psychology, et cetera, and create something that would address some of these topics within sort of the confines of what a college course is expected to do. So that's sort of on the aside project that I'm trying to look at. So, but yeah.
Well, the courses that we're developing in Illinois are being like soft rolled out this month, and hopefully next month will be open for anybody, so you could be in touch. And we're putting those online. There's not going to be any barrier. It's not monetized. We're hoping to have continuing education credits associated with it eventually, but not immediately when it starts. And we picked this because it was a good place to start, but I think that you identify a great challenge is to institutionalize it as much as possible. And so I hope that the curricular elements could be packaged by any of the people doing it or by anybody else and introduced. We don't seek to control it. We want to disseminate it. But exactly how, we'll have to see. One of the things that we do, because, as Jim said, this topic might not be so popular if framed in a kind of security way, is we embed it in other things. So when I teach trauma-informed care, I teach this. When I teach other kinds of violence prevention, or public health prevention, I teach this. So I slip it in different ways.
I think what could be possible, and my executive director came up with this term the other day, it all made sense to me, but we are providing psychosocial supports in a public safety space. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's because it becomes a whole new thing, right? Because I think as much as people are waving the flag around defund the police, this is part of that movement actually. In some strange way, it kind of relates to that because it's about, we have to partner with law enforcement in a way that there's boundaries and communication happening. But and for us, it's creating a whole new way of working with the police that perhaps maybe hasn't been done before. which becomes a discipline almost. But I think it's really these psychosocial supports in a public safety space. And maybe we learn 10 years from now, this becomes a whole new master's degree, like a whole new thing. I don't know. But maybe that is some of the differences that we're seeing. But I think, people who want to defund the police, well, this is an opportunity to join that movement here, actually, right? It's a way of kind of saying, we can actually take on some of the burden and some of the challenge, where police may not necessarily be helpful or necessary, so.
Okay, well, I am just getting that red dot now, which means we are fully out of time, as much as I personally would love to keep this conversation going. Thank you all so much for your words today. Thank you.
You?
For your participation.